What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Creative Code. I am your host, Dylan Bennett, and on today's episode of the Creative Code, I am chatting with one of the top podcast coaches in the industry, Ryan Sullivan. Now, Ryan is my own podcast coach, and I worked with him toward the end of last year, beginning of this year, 2024, and we discussed topics, content, my podcast, and really ironing out the nuts and bolts of getting everything going. In today's chat specifically, we discussed the importance of creativity in the podcasting space and how B2B businesses specifically can use creativity in content build out and marketing strategy to not only build their clientele, but their entire business. If you stick around toward the end of the episode, you're actually going to hear a lot of cool stuff about Ryan himself. I asked him how he turned his own podcast into the business that he runs today, and how he turned his passion for music into a DJ and rap career. But enough of me. Let's get right into it. Let's get into the chat with Ryan. Ryan, welcome to the show, man. It is great, first of all, to see you and to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's been a minute since we connected. We had been working on the podcast, which obviously we'll go into, but I just appreciate you having me here on the show.
Yeah, of course. Speaking of that, I do want to thank you for all the stuff that we did on our original coaching calls. I mentioned it a little bit in the intro, but Ryan was my podcast coach toward the end of last year and the beginning of this year. Kind of helped me rebrand the podcast, find an actual niche, something to talk about, and kind of line myself out here. And now he's the first official guest on the Creative Code, which is really cool. So, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and take a couple minutes and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I appreciate that, man. Always I respect anybody who invests in their podcast because there's obviously a time investment, but then the coaching investment, that's something that we really push. So for context, we help B2B companies create profitable podcasts, but it doesn't have to be necessarily profitability because when we go down that avenue, people always want to know, okay, then how do we track the ROI? And there's all these bigger questions. Where I usually go is I revert to, hey, what is working? What is not working? The problem that I'm typically solving, there's two. The first one is the launch of a podcast for a company. Obviously, branding is very important. So you want to make sure you have all these details in place, and that can be a little bit stressful. And then number two is there's a lot of B2B podcasts that just aren't really working for these hosts, founders, or companies who are doing them because they went out to kind of maybe launch essentially a replica show of other shows in their industry, and they're not seeing the traction. So those are kind of the two problems we solve full time on a day-to-day basis. And then we have production as well, and a few other odds and ends when it comes to podcasting. But that's the gist.
That's really cool, man. Yeah, we talked a little bit when we initially did the coaching on like some of the different things that you guys do, and I was like floored on that initial call that you did on like the in-depth level of where you guys take it. Even just on that free call, like we talked for an hour, and you gave me a ton of stuff that I was like, I mean, I could get a ton of value out of this and just implement what we just talked about, but I definitely felt it was worth it to do the calls.
Well, yeah, man, that's the thing, right? Like that's kind of our, philosophy too, where it's like there's the strategy, there's the coaching, and then there's the implementation, right? So in 30 minutes or an hour, we're only going to be able to talk about what we could do or what you could do. That's not even anywhere close to actually getting into the weeds, which we did, together. Mm-hmm. So right. That's really where at least we really find ourselves here in this podcast industry, which is taking a coaching and consulting based approach rather than a production and editing based approach. There's a lot of shops, firms, companies that do what we do, quote unquote, but they don't actually do what we do. They don't actually go in and dissect the podcast, which is the most important thing, right? Because if you don't have the strategy, if you're not building in predictability, then how are you going to get predictable results? So yeah, man, it all comes down. I mean, that's how you judge. I would say you would judge any company is how does that kind of first call go? What's their philosophy behind coaching, right? And that's something that I've kind of taken from a few different areas and tried to apply to podcasting.
That's awesome. So before we get too far, one thing I want to point out, since obviously we did some coaching calls, there was a call that we did that you spit out this It was the first time I think I've ever heard it live, but you spit out this motivational quote, and you're literally wearing the T-shirt right now. But we're sitting on this call, right? And he throws out this quote: "Thoughts become things when goals become habits." And I was like, "Dude, you got to throw that on a T-shirt." And Ryan emails me. He messaged me on LinkedIn like 3 weeks later. He's like, "Dude, I did the T-shirt." I was like, "No, you didn't." And then he sends me a mock-up and then throws one in the mail for me. It was awesome.
Man, that's it. That's what you got to do too. And I had this. This is a sales lesson here too, where I'm like, oh, we'll sell these shirts, and it's like, okay, well, hey, no, you're not trying to launch a separate clothing entity of this business, man. Hold your horses. But I appreciate that you like that quote. I'm proud of it. I always say every once in a while, I get a good one. So I'll that's an amalgamation of I think it was like Kai Green. I'm pretty sure, the bodybuilder. He had a thoughts become things was his things, yeah. his quote. But that it's but how? Right. And so that's, I guess my mind was going on the how piece, not as much the what piece. So appreciate you, man. Appreciate you rocking the shirt. It's a great gym shirt.
I wear it all the time. I wear it to work out all the time, man. It's a great shirt.
All right, we got to do it. We'll work on that. I'll work on that merch line in the next year or so. Try to get that out.
That sounds great. All right, man. So in doing research for this, I found a report from whatsthebigdata.com, and it estimates about 4.2 million active podcasts right now. With that many podcasts, I mean, there's got to be some overlap in like topics and styles. What can a B2B business do to break out of a sea of sameness or prevent a lot of overlap to where they can really stand out and make their podcast worth it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few ways to look at it. The first way is actually breaking out from the sameness. So how to do it is just doing it, right? Which is not easy to do. That's why a lot of podcasts are similar. Is because it takes a lot of work, time, effort, consistency, and really creativity. It's the creative, right? And that's why we sit down. That's why we have over 100 resources. Docs, everything from sheets to guides, right? All of these things are to try to unlock these ideas that make these podcasts successful. And that's not to say that you can't have a simple podcast that works. I would argue for that. So simplicity is key, right? For consistency's sake. But also, if you are in a sea of podcasts, I would just use this example, right? Which is, you have a company that creates a podcast about maybe founders or entrepreneurship, right? And that company has its own product and its own services. And if you're not using that podcast to generate relationships that then lead to ROI, for example, that's called account-based podcasting. If you're not doing that, then what are you really doing, right? Because a lot of these shows have on people who are just obscure. Like outside of even in the LinkedIn world, like I'm just known in my own little subset in my own circle, right? But like nobody outside of that knows who I am, right? So if I start a podcast with other people who nobody knows, then who is going to want to listen to that? Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to get random people to listen to other random people. So that's probably the first thing you want to try. You want to look at and say, is that what we're doing here? And in probably 75% of cases, that is what they're trying to do. Now, I'll say somebody's probably already done that, right? Somebody's probably already interviewed these people that nobody knows. And that's fine. 30 downloads, 50 downloads. Great. I'm not shooting for the stars either. I'm not trying to become the next Rogan or Gary Vee. It's not going to help me, right? I'm in a niche and I stay in my niche. So to round out that thought, it's mostly niche oriented. That's how I would look at it. I would look at it I love using other shows as inspiration for sure, but look at how another show does it in another subset, right? If you have for example, right, I was on a podcast called Cash Flow Fight Club, where it's like Fight Club mixed with like your cash flow or whatever, right? But then we got on and talked about podcasting. So I'm like, so what is the show? Like, it's not the title of the show. So a lot of, and I love Mike, I love Leisha, the people who run the show, they're great people. But that's what we talked about in the episode. It's like, okay, you can have this baller concept, but you have to also run the concept. You got to run it like a show. And so, yeah, there's just so many different kind of variations of how you can start. But I think it comes down to having that first off, what do you want the podcast to do for you? And then we can start going from there, because a lot of these shows, they just say we're starting a podcast and nobody asks why. And that's the most important question. Then once you figure that out, it's like, okay, well, now we know why. Now we can go to how, right? But you got to start with why.
I love that. I love that. And I'm going to have to check out that podcast because that's like the most interesting name I've ever heard of, like with the cash flow.
Yeah, it's so cool. No, it's such a cool concept. So I was actually on it with my friend James, who he's the owner of One Fine Play, which is they work on more cultural podcasts with hundreds of thousands, millions of downloads, like larger shows. We work on more niche shows. So we were both on there talking about this with them, right? And I'm not sure if they ended up changing the execution of the podcast later, but he was a little bit more direct maybe than I was. But that was his point in saying, "Hey, we should be duking it out on about cash flow right now and not talking about podcasting." So yeah, man, it is hard. It's really hard. And I've had a conversational in-person interview show before. And, I was happy with getting, tens of thousands of views and thousands of subscribers and, 5 to 10,000 downloads. Like, I was good with that. I looked at that as a success, but I also wasn't going, man, this content deserves more. It's like, no, it didn't, because nobody knows who these people are, right? These stories are not as interesting as a Rogan or a Ferris or whoever you want to have. So yeah, it's really, you got to look at the niche podcasts that you can actually emulate and make sure they're good ones, because if you do emulate something or copy it, you want to make sure it's pretty good.
That's right. That's right. In my opinion, one of those ways that you can stand out too is just embracing your unique creativity. That's what I talk a lot about on this show, is just kind of finding and embracing your own creativity and your unique style. I mean, that's a huge part of podcasting. I mean, because you can, like you said, you can take bits and pieces from larger podcasts, the really big ones, or even just ones in your industry, and you can take bits and pieces from it. But if you're trying to copy the whole thing, what's unique about that? So when you're coaching somebody, or if there's a business that's looking to start a podcast, what kind of things should they consider to develop that voice, to develop that style or uniqueness?
Yeah. So the first one is back to, what do you want this podcast to do for you? Because a podcast is a vehicle. It'll only do, excuse me, one big thing really well. And then it could have sub goals below those things, but it's only really going to do one thing really well. And then in the sub goals, it'll do those pretty well. And then the more jobs you give it, the worse it's going to do. Right. So that's the first one, where most of the time nobody asks that question. So that's where we start. Then from there, we get into not only who is the listener, like who's the persona. When I say persona, I mean an actual person. Like, oh, we worked with this guy named Jeff. This was the situation he was in. He actually, say it's a marketing podcast, he had no SEO at all. Like, he never did SEO. He didn't even know how to start. He read some articles, and then we came in, we did, a $5,000 project, and now he ranks here on Google, right? It's like, okay, great. Let's create Jeff, take him and create a persona of him. And then let's define the position he was in before he came to you, right? And so what that's going to do is going to help you. It's going to help you identify the position that the listener is in when they get to you, right? Because the podcast falls at typically the bottom of the funnel. The way we do it at Podcast Principles, our podcast spans the whole funnel, but that's another conversation. But for most podcasts, they do really well at a certain place in the funnel, right? So it's, where do you want that place to be? For most, it's the bottom, because podcasts are high barrier to entry. In terms of, they're very consumable and accessible, but at the same time, they do require time, which is the thing that most people don't have, to listen, right? So there's people, it's much easier for somebody to scroll and see the social posts than they are to listen to the podcast. So who is that person that is going to click on that? And then once they do, the information that they receive, the information, education, inspiration, whatever that is, whatever you're providing, entertainment, it could be a mix of these, right? but we're making sure to the highest extent we can, because we can't predict the future. But what we can do is map these things out to at least reach a certain person in a certain position. Now, once you do all that, because again, nobody does that. So if once you do all that, then it's very obvious, right? Like what our positioning is, hey, we help B2B companies who use LinkedIn to generate leads, create a consistent system to create content through podcasting, right? There's a lot of requirements in that sentence. So if a company comes to my podcast and the episode is how to start your B2B podcast when you are already creating text content, right? It's like that's not going to get 10 million downloads, right? It's not supposed to. So when it comes to, okay, how do you do that? You got to start having these conversations. And really what it is asking the right questions in the right order to build out that podcast. And then once you go ahead and make that intro or that outro or the artwork, which are the elements of the show, the most important elements of any podcast are the things that people are going to judge you on, which is artwork, intro, outro, description, promotion, clips, etc. When you design all these things from the beginning, it's very easy. It's so much easier. Not even easier. It's so obvious who it's for and who it's not for. And that's the goal.
A lot there to unpack for somebody who maybe doesn't have a podcast. I mean, having gone through your calls, thankfully, I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, like my first probably 15 episodes, I was just like putting stuff out that I wanted to hear. I didn't have an idea of who I wanted to talk to, of what kind of stuff I was doing. Like every podcast was a little bit different. I talked about sports, I talked about fitness, I talked about business, I talked about, personal growth. I mean, you listen to like 2 minutes of one of my podcasts and you were like, dude, you are all over the place. Mm-hmm. So in trying to find like a direction, I think having a specific persona or somebody that you're talking to is a great way to do it. You made a point that when you do that, when you have a specific person that you're trying to talk to, you're not going to have millions of people listening in most cases. You're going to have 1,000, you're gonna have 5,000, you're gonna have 10,000, but that's the point. Like those are the type of people you want to have such a finite funnel that like you're hitting them at this point, not so much in here. Like you want to hit them between here and here.
Yeah. And if if you look at, you mentioned 4.2 million active podcasts, I'm going to assume it's probably less than that, just depending on how they define active. But in these numbers, right? If you look at another number, which is if you get anywhere from 50 to 100 downloads an episode, which means like 50 to 100 people click listen, right? You're in like the top 5% of podcasts. So if you just have anybody listening, you're basically you're in a really good spot, right? Because that's how all of these things work, So that's kind of how you got to look at that. But back to what you said, man, like, yeah, it is a little intimidating. There's no doubt. But so podcasting is intimidating. We saw this in 2020, right? A lot of companies went out 2020, 2021, made podcasts, and then the amount of podcasts being launched dropped by, 70%. So but the amount of listeners went up. So this medium is definitely not for everybody. It's not for every company. There are things that are universal where it's like every company should do SEO. Like, yeah, I probably agree with that. You don't need a personality for that. But for podcasting, you do. So yeah, man, it's there is an intimidation factor, and it's not supposed to be easy. In my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it like the quote says, anything worth doing is not supposed to be easy.
Yep.
You've mentioned that to do a podcast the right way, it's going to take time, both in the development stages and then in the execution. I mean, it takes time to record, to edit, to do the promos, to do the design work, the artwork, the whole thing. I mean, it takes a boatload of time, and that's something that not a lot of small business owners have. You've kind of alluded to it already, but what do you think is the measure of success for a podcast, for a B2B, in a B2B setting?
Yeah, it's tough because it will depend, but here's my thing. I think I'm pretty sure a lot of companies, yeah. So I mean, small business is definitely its own animal. Let me back up. So there's two types of podcasts, two types of brands. Sorry, there's an influencer brand and then there's a business brand. So in an influencer brand, the podcast is the product, the content is the thing they sell, right? So they use that content. Their job, which is many YouTubers, right? If you see a YouTuber with millions of subscribers, that's a one person, that's a 15, in many cases 15, 20 person team disguised as one person, right? So that's a influencer brand, right? The product is the content itself. Then you have a business brand, right? Which is like the services that the companies that we have. Our podcast is not our product. It is a part of our marketing, right? Even us being a podcast company, we don't rely on the podcast to bring us all of our revenue, right? We have services, products, coaching, group coaching, right? We sell stuff. So the first thing you got to do is to go, which one are we? If you try to do both, it's not going to work. Because companies go to us and, yeah, but when can I expect sponsorship? And I'm saying, oh, whoa, let's back up. I thought this was to market your product. Then they say, well, yeah, but can't we also? Well, yeah, you can have your cake and eat it too. But how many things are you going to promote to this audience that you've spent 5-10 years to build, right? So it's that's how I like to preface before we get into the B2B conversation. Okay, now let's go to B2B, which is B2B stands for business to business, right? In reality, you're always going to buy, people are buying from people, right? So B2B and B2C, they're not that much different, but in B2C, you don't need a person, right? So you go to Walmart, you buy your thing, it's over, right? You don't need a person, you trust the brand, right? So in B2B, a lot of companies trust the person before they trust the brand. So in that sense, right, they see your LinkedIn video and they're like, this guy knows Canva, and then they hire you for Canva stuff. But they don't know about your business, right? Mm-hmm. So great B2B companies also have great corporate brands, but that takes a lot of time, money, effort to build. So in the B2B context, most B2B companies actually have focused too much on the corporate brand and they have no personal brand. And again, in B2B, the personal brand, if you set it up like this, can sell at scale because you don't scale, but your content with you in it scales. So from a B2B perspective, this is what a podcast can do for you. It allows you to be, quote unquote, the man, right? So the man, the woman, the whatever, I'm good with whatever it is, whoever you are. But what you're going to do as the man, we'll use that as the example. You're going to sit in your chair, you're going to talk your shit for 20 or 30 minutes, and then you're going to get off. And everybody else is going to do everything else. And then poof, you're going to appear on a social media feed. People are going to trust you. People are going to buy from you because they saw you there. That's the ideal case, right? The scenario without getting into any of the details. But that's really it. That's really it from B2B perspective. It's like it allows you to build a personal brand at scale, and your content, you essentially go out as little army troops, that get spread out across social media,
Yeah, I love that. The ideas between the two different kinds are something that I think a lot of people tend to miss. Like, you listen to Gary Vee's podcast, you listen to Ed Milet's podcast, you listen to, small business podcasts. You may not realize in a lot of those cases that a lot of them are different. Like you listen to Gary Vee or Ed Milet or Alex Hormozi, they do have something just absolutely massive behind them, but they're building a brand around them so that, like you said, they can have 100 little army men of themselves out doing all the work.
Yep, exactly. And that's why they're not a good example. Like, that's like, even Gary Vee, like, he's not a good example. Like, his come up is a good example, right? But he's a media company, right? So it's like, if you're not launching a media company, or you're not like 16 years old and want to start a TikTok, then like, how beneficial is the advice? What you want to look at, what works the best is specific advice. Specific advice always works the best. So
100%.
the best thing you can do is go to somebody who has specific advice and get that advice, and pay for that advice. And that's what I did too. I got a coach at the end of the last year, and it changed I wouldn't be sitting here today, because in 2022, I would have told you we only work with solopreneurs. We don't work with businesses. We don't work with teams. Now we don't work with solopreneurs. We only work with businesses. We only work with teams. So it's that, like, you got to go through those lumps, obviously, to get there. But yeah, you got to have the right, you got to be taking notes from the right things. And there's a lot that you can learn from Gary. There's a lot you can learn from Ed Milet. But you're learning from their step 100. You're at step 3, right? It's like I'm at step like from 0 to like Alex Ramosi. Like I feel like I'm at like 11% right now. 12% has loaded, right? It's like, so yeah, man, that's why, and I love all those podcasts. All of them that you mentioned, I listen to. I'm a diehard,
Yeah, you and me both. I mean, I try and pull something from all of them, but like you said, it's all about context, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot out there about when you get a coach, get somebody who's 2 or 3 steps ahead of you, because 1, you can relate to them, and 2, they're going to understand exactly where you're at. Whereas if you get somebody who's at like step 100 and you're at step 10, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. That was like 4 or 5 years ago. Here's what I did, but I don't really remember a lot of it.
Yeah, true. You don't want it to be so far away, but you also don't want them to be so close. So yeah, it's I took way too long to hire coaches, and because I didn't get it, even though I was one. And then once you do hire them, then you realize like, oh, okay, they do what I do, but for me. But right. It's like, man, it took me too long. So yeah, my quick advice totally is, and I know you'd probably reflect this too, like just don't think about it. Once you know that it's the right person, then don't think about it and just do it.
Yeah, because the longer you think about it, the longer you're just gonna wonder why you didn't do it sooner when you eventually do it.
It's the perfect.
That's exactly what I did.
And it's the Alex Ramosi framework, right? It's the you are in the position you're in now because you haven't done anything else. So as long as you're okay with staying in this position, if you don't take this next step, then you're going to only, like, the reason you're here is to stop not taking steps and start taking a step. And yeah, it's that's whole thing. And as an aside, yeah, I go to him mostly for sales stuff because obviously offer, funnel, lead magnets. I did run his gift card method too, which does work. So there's some tactics to take there, but it's like, I go into these podcasts, like I don't watch Gary Vee, right? Like I watch him if he has state of, like, he's talking to a Fortune 500 brand. Okay, I want to know what he's talking about. Like what are they talking about? Because I work with some bigger companies, but eventually I'll work with a company like that. Okay, cool. Alex Ramosi, I'm trying to work on this sales thing, so I'll listen to a podcast about it, but that's back to that specificity,
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge part of it, and a lot of that comes from like your own specificity of your style of creativity, your style of creating content too, and that really kind of leads back into the podcast thing, is like your own style and your creativity leads to your connection with your audience, right? When you're coaching somebody who's either new or maybe a long-term podcaster, they've got 50 episodes, maybe they're somewhere like where I'm at now, like 50 to 100 episodes.
Yeah.
How do you suggest that they continue to freshen up their content, like keep going? Because you listen to, like, I know he's not a great example in this case again, but like Gary Vee, you listen to 5 episodes, you listen to the next 5 episodes, you're going to have pretty much carry over like the exact same stuff, right?
Yep.
Where can a B2B podcast kind of look towards to keep their content fresh and keep people coming back?
Yeah, and I see both sides of this. I think there's a world where, if you need new ideas, like maybe you have a bigger problem. But I also understand that the world is ever evolving and changing, and business is changing. So it's counterintuitive, but it's really just putting yourself in the position to create the new ideas, right? So let's take this for example. I just wrote this down, right? I have a group coaching program that where I do workshops every week. Now, in the first workshop, I explained what I just explained to you, which is influencer versus business brand, right? I just realized that I had never made a podcast episode about that. So then I just wrote that down, and then that's going to be an episode, right? That's how it happens. We're not going to come up with great creative ideas by trying to come up with great creative ideas. So B2B needs to get out of the office, get into the woods, go take a shower, go fishing, walk down the street. I don't know. If you're in a city, get out of the city. If you're in the country, go to the city. I don't know, right? And or just get yourself in new environments, right? Go to a networking. I got the best B2B advice that I've ever gotten the other day, which was go to networking events where there's nobody there, right? I will guarantee that the questions that those people ask you, somebody probably has never asked you those questions before, right? Or it's been years since they have, right? So to come up with new content ideas, like, sure, there's probably creative development companies that like can answer this in like 2 sentences, right? But like, it seems to me that it's that constant like coming up with it, taking this note, right? For me, I have my notes on my phone, right? My Apple Notes, which is on all my devices, and there's just ideas there, man. Like, or I ask people. I hired a coach. His name's Jacob Peggs. He helps people create offers, group coaching programs. He's like the king of bottom of funnel sales, I would call him. And he sent me. I was like, what do you think? Like, give me some ideas for my workshops. And he just sent me like 8 of them. I don't like 7 of them I wouldn't use, but one of them I was like, all right, awesome. And then I could also, this is the cliche, but hey man, ChatGPT's got some good shit. It really does. I wouldn't have said this to you a year ago, but now I'm saying it. And I stole a prompt from Alex Sheridan, so if you want the prompt, props to him. But that's another way too.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd throw a ton of stuff into ChatGPT just to even like get the brain going a little bit. If you're somebody like me who sits in an office all day for your 9 to 5, or you sit at your desk and you're working on stuff, you got to have a change of scenery. That's one thing that I love, even though like, because I work in a gym for a 9 to 5 and, I sit at my desk, just anything to kind of break up the thought pattern, break up my movement pattern even.
Yep.
Go on a walk, go get on the treadmill, go walk around the gym, go, walk down across the street, just get a little bit of movement, go for a quick drive. I mean, that can play a huge role in your ability to think creatively. There's tons of studies. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I know that there's tons of studies about, your neuroplasticity and how your brain works when you move. So, I mean, that's a huge part of it.
But everybody wants a system. That's the thing, right? And there are systems, but systems are the steps, and the steps are not always it's not that every time you repeat the steps the same thing happens, right? So they're not real. There's no guarantee in that. And it's I mean, if you really want to get down to it, right, like that is like trying to look for a system to do something like that is kind of taking away from what somebody is asking for, right? They're like, how do I have a system to come up with new ideas? It's like, yeah, but that's the point, is that there is nobody has ever done that. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are like courses and shit that you can take and they'll tell you that it'll do that, right? But yeah, man, I really do take the scenic route home with that.
I definitely do that too. Like, there's some days that I'm like, man, I'm in a lull today. I'll be looking at my whiteboard just trying to think of like ad ideas for the gym, or like I'm trying to think of some podcast ideas or something, and I'm like, man, I'm not gonna learn anything here. I'm not gonna think of anything. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go for a walk. I'm gonna go for a drive. I'll be back in 30 minutes. And by the time I come back, I could fill a whole notepad. I mean, I'm taking notes too. Like, I'll fill a whole damn notepad of just different ideas of podcast ideas, and it can be about anything. But, sitting in the same place is not conducive to creativity, in my opinion.
Mm-mm. No, I'm with you, man. I'm with you. And I'll give you a tactical one though, which is do a flip on something else, right? So it's like, what we used to call ourselves, like, oh, the wedding planners of podcasting, right? So then we would create. It's kind of funny because I haven't said that in like 6 months. It's so funny because we used to say it all the time. But okay, so I would create posts that are like, here's why a podcast and a wedding are pretty similar, right? It's like you have to marry the audience or you marry the bride, or it's like taking those things, right? Things that work in other contexts and applying them to your thing. Like if historical figures had podcasts, that's a post that I made where like Marilyn Monroe had a podcast. What would it look like? If Abe Lincoln had one, what would it be called? Right. Doing those type of exercises. There are exercises that can do this. Right. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I try and incorporate those every now and again too. It's part of like my morning thing when I get up, just jot down anything that you're thinking about. That's a big one for me, is just take 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be a long time. I mean, I know we've all got busy schedules, especially small business owners. Yep. Take 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes before you go to bed, and just write everything that you're thinking down. All of it. Like anything that comes into your mind, it doesn't matter how weird it is. It could be like pickle flavored ice cream, like write it out.
Yep.
Even that weird thing that's going to come out could eventually lead to something down the road.
Yeah, man. That's why I fill notebooks, man. I fill them up.
Mm-hmm. I got so bad because like I would go through those spiral notebooks, and I would plow through them, but then I would never go back and look, or I'd never be able to find anything. I found Notion a couple years ago, and I fill that thing up like a spiral notebook all day long.
So you've converted from writing to mostly typing, you're saying, though?
Yes, to an extent, because I still have a physical notepad in front of me taking notes while we're talking, but
those are for bullet points essentially, but for like dumping your thoughts, you'll type that now.
And I do a little bit of both. Like sometimes I'll dump the whole thing out in my handwriting because I tend to remember it a little bit better, but then I'll transfer it into a big note on my Notion so that when I think about that random thing again in like 3 months, I can actually go search it.
Oh man, dude, I gotta say, and too, like the Fathom note taker, man, like those note takers, it's so nice. You can search all of the transcriptions of all of your calls. So it's like, what podcast platform did they say they were going to use? I just type in Buzzsprout and there it is. They did say they were going to use Buzzsprout.
That's awesome.
But like all of these things are, they're add-ons. I think one I'm going to try before I love Notion. I use it for business, but I don't use it for any type of journaling. I think I'm going to try a digital note taker, like Rocketbook is an example of one, or like the Amazon I think has its own, where it's like a tablet that you can just draw on, and then it'll upload it. So I mean we'll see. I haven't made that full transition yet, but
I've taken a peek at a couple of those before. The guy who owns the gyms, he and I are really good buddies, and he what was it called? I don't remember. It's one of those digital notebooks. Like you can write it out and then digitize the whole thing and email it to yourself. I want to do one of those too. I can't remember what it's called though.
I know exactly what you're talking about though. My friend mentioned it to me the other day. I went on a little streak of looking them up and trying to decide, but I didn't end up buying one. So I guess I got to just take the action.
Yep. Now there's 1,000 ways to express creativity. Obviously, podcasting is one of those, but storytelling is a huge one, in my opinion, both through content, through podcasting, through just communication as a whole. We told a story at the beginning of this about the T-shirt you're wearing. How do you think that plays into the importance of like a B2B podcast?
Yeah, this is something that I had not consciously thought about. So like when I thought about my content, I'm like, oh, I don't do storytelling. Like but then you look and there's stories, like every post is a story. So it just depends on your definition. But I know for a fact that they're very important. I am not somebody who I would say has like a framework for doing it, but it's the glue, right? Every lesson has to have doesn't have to, but could have some type of kind of, intro, body, conclusion, there's a challenge and then you give the context, and then by the end you solve the challenge and here's how you can do it too, type of thing. All of these are kind of like formats that you can use, but I like the act of storytelling. I do like appreciate it, but I haven't thought through the how of it enough to be like, here's how I would do it. Like, I can tell you for like a podcast, okay, give me a story and then I'll kind of show you how I would arrange it in an episode. But I don't have anything that's like, here's a mind-blowing storytelling tactic, but I know it's important.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge thing. There's a couple creators on LinkedIn and on Instagram that I follow that they talk about that a little bit. There's a few frameworks there, but I'm kind of right there with you. Like I don't have like here's the 6-step process to building a good story for your content. It's just like you have to have it, and you got to get
what
reps.
it is. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know what it is? It is reps. Yeah, 100%. So it's audience awareness. That's kind of because storytelling is a tactic. It's not like a thing, It's just a thing that you have a jumble of words, and then you can just determine like, oh, there's a story in there, right? Okay, it's just it either is or it isn't, right? But audience awareness is a skill, so that's something that you can develop. So if I've done 100 guest interviews or 200 or however many I've done, I have an awareness where I could expound more on certain things, but I don't. Or others, I do go a little bit further, right? And so that is from a content creation, B2B content creation, doesn't matter, small business doesn't matter what type of content you're making. Having creating the right context for the right format, and in that case, being aware of where this is going to go. And this gets into the weeds a little bit, but this is how we're advising podcasters to do it is there are ways that you can say things, right, that will enable you to use the content in different ways, which is, I'll say it like this. So if I'm going to answer this question, right, I can say, if I were a B2B founder, this is how I would look at audience awareness and connecting with your audience, right? So Dylan asked me a question, then I answer like that instead of just answering the question. When I answer like that, Dylan can go take that clip, and now it's a clip, right? Now it's a moment because I added context. So I don't focus on storytelling as much as I focus on that audience awareness piece. And those are you're doing mental jujitsu here, right? Like you're trying to see when I'm going to stop talking / what am I talking about? Did I go off topic? You're balancing where you want this conversation to go. You're looking at the time. You're like, is this enough time? Is this too much time? Did we get to that thing? Did I lose them? Like there's all these 7 to 10 different things going on. So I'm not saying it's easy to do, but like you said, man, it's reps, brother. It's all reps. And it does come, there's not much that's going to replace the reps.
100%. And I think one of the topics that we talked about earlier, your understanding of your audience, like who exactly you're talking to, plays into that a ton.
Oh, big time. I mean, because that's why you do all that, right? Like that's why you do all that. That's why you define all of these things, right? Because then I know who I'm talking to. Like who I'm talking to, Mm-hmm. Even if this podcast isn't for B2B founders, it may or may not be, but you mentioned small business owners, but you also mentioned B2B. So it's like you have that awareness to know when that clip goes out that it is going to include those words, right? And this comes back to the beginning, man. This comes back to what podcasts don't do, which is that, right? They don't really speak to the person, right? And so when I say the person, I mean you. I mean the person listening, watching. That is a you. That is not a them. That is a you. That is an individual. Nobody's watching. There's not 16 people sitting and listening to this all the same in an audience. There's no audience. It's all just a bunch of individual people. So yeah, that's what you have to optimize for when you're speaking to an audience, but in this case, just people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I have loved about the podcast arena anyway, is like you're literally just talking to, like even in this setting, you and I are chatting back and forth, right? But we're talking to the person listening to this, right?
Yep.
And that's what makes podcasts different in my opinion. Like obviously you have that in some other realms, like you do it on LinkedIn, you do it on Instagram, whatever it may be, but like you're really speaking to that person, and that's where a lot of the great creators start to advance their content, is they literally start speaking directly to you.
Yeah, when it or at least it feels like that, and that's when it's great, and that's when There's more cringy or less cringy ways to do it, but some people do it really well, others not. Like Rogan won't ever do that. Like, right? Like he doesn't say like, "Hey, you business owner." Like, no. But like, Ed Milet does that, right? He's like, "You got payroll, right?" And I'm like, "Shit, I do. I got payroll." And it's like, So yeah, man, it is. It's yeah. If when you're in a position that we're in, right, when we have these smaller audiences, niche audiences, it's even more important, no doubt.
100%. Now, with this new format, I'm talking a lot more about creativity. We've obviously touched on it a couple different ways. How do you think about it in your work, whether that's working with clients, making your own content, doing your podcast? I don't know if you still do it, but your DJ work? How do you think about creativity there?
Yeah, so I started a DJ company at the end of last year. Nice. Yeah, no, thanks, man. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's something I've been doing for 10 years, so it's a pretty big part of my life as a hobby that turned into a side hustle that turned into a job that went back into a side hustle, But also, I'm a rapper. I'm a music producer. I've been doing that for a long, long time. I got music out. If you want to listen to it, SULLYBOP, Sully Bop on the drop. You can go just Google that. I'll come up. But, that's my outlet, man. Now, what happened when I started this business, though, is that I had to put all my creative energy into marketing, sale, like literally just creating a business from nothing, So a lot of my creativity is actually in the business, which I think has definitely enabled me to get to where I'm at today, just in the position that I'm in, which is still basically a small business. But when it comes to the work that I do with clients, for example, I'm enabling them to get creative. That's the goal, right? We're trying to create that space where we tell you, hey, on the call, we're not supposed to come up with the answer on the call. On the call, we're supposed to get all the tools, right? We're supposed to look at the tool shed and be like, oh, yeah, my hammer's here, like my saw's here, great. Let's make sure we put them in the right order. Let's make sure we got, our safety equipment. And then when it comes to actually doing the job, okay, that's why we set that foundation. So what I mean by that is there's a world where creating pressure does help, right? Like there's a world where creating pressure does give you more create more creativity. But in this world that I'm in, for the most part, these podcasts are an arm of the larger entity. So we have the freedom to take our time, to be creative, to fail, to test. And that's what I want to build. That's what I try to build into it, because, man, like I get it, man. I whether I work a 9 to 5 or not, it doesn't matter. I'm still at this desk all day. I'm still marketing like you. It doesn't, when you do the same things, you don't create the space for it, right? So that's why I need coaching. That's why I hire the people that I hire, because I can't do it for myself, but that's what I try to do for our shows and our podcasters, is to create that space for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part. Even if you don't hire somebody, is to create a space where you can be creative. That's something I've tried to work into my schedule. It's on my daily habit list. That like I just try to spend 20 to 30 minutes every day of just like, all right, let's go build some stuff. Let's throw some ideas on the board. Let's see what we can do, because most of what I do is graphic design work, that sort of thing. Like I'll just kind of I'll have like 2 or 3 ideas going into it, and I'll just kind of start throwing some stuff on the canvas and see what happens. But I think it's incredibly important, no matter what kind of content you're building, what kind of creativity you foster, is to give yourself time to do it.
Yeah, or just actually doing it too. Like I thought about this today. I'm like, I love the content that we're making, and our videos have came a long way, and our podcast, but internally I'm saying, or like for our brand, right? But I'm like, can we just like freaking make this crazy, man? Like, can we just do some crazy shit? It's like, yeah, we can. Then you have to decide to do it, and then doing it is a whole thing. But like,
right.
Yeah, man, creating these spaces to think outside the box on purpose, right? That's really what we're talking about. Um, you know, the grind is the grind, but and ideas are are just ideas, right? They're nothing more than that until you go out and do it. But hey, if you have a good one, man, and you know, it might have some viral potential you don't even know. You might not even know until you do it.
Yeah, I mean, an idea is nothing without execution. So that just like you were saying, you got to put some skin behind it and actually do it.
Yep. That's it.
So tell me a little bit more about podcast principles. You mentioned the new group setting. I think that's really cool. Obviously, we did some one-on-one stuff. You got the podcast side of things. Give us a little bit of background. Like how did that come about? What else do you guys do?
Yeah. So I'll start there, which is group coaching. I've never joined a group before. My argument for never doing it is because I wouldn't do it. So why would I do it? Kind of a selfish way to look at business. You in the beginning, you are your customer, and then you're not your customer anymore. I'm not my customer, right? I serve my customer, right? My job is to study them, not to study me, right? So I was on a call with a guy. His name's Harry. He's in our group. That was just a bit of a foreshadow, but he was like, "Yeah, man, do you have anything cheaper?" I was like, "No, we used to work with solopreneurs and do this coaching stuff, but we just do retainers now." And he was like, "Have you ever thought about a group?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but I don't do groups." He was like, "Well, why not?" I'm like, "Well, I wouldn't join one." He's like, "What does that have to do with anything?" Like, well, I guess you're right.
I love that he just called you out.
Yeah, and dude, he's called me out a few times, but that's what you need. It's always good. He goes,
100%.
He goes, "Hey man, you're teaching us all about these clips. Why don't you have captions on your clips?" And I'm like, "Because the performance of the clip is exactly the same whether I have captions on it or not." He's like, "Yeah, but what if people want to read the captions?" I'm like, "Well, the performance is it's like, you're right, Harry. I am going to go put
the math works, but all right, I'll do it."
Yeah, whatever. So, but for real, I should have captions on the clips, So, but yeah, you need people like that. But anyway, so Harry made the suggestion. I told him, "Hey, bro, give me 3 weeks." Sent it out to the email list, pre-sold, did a pre-sale, hired Jacob Peggs for an hour, and because he's the group coaching master, and we set the group up in 3 weeks, and we sold 9 spots, and now we have a core group of 5 people, which was my goal. I didn't want a big group, so we have that. We're doing a 12-week sprint. Am I going to continue to do it? Maybe. Haven't really made that decision yet. I want to do something in person moving forward. So the next group is going to probably be a little bit different, but I want to do something with a in-person event in the group with that group, right? So like that's my next goal. But in reality, what is our core offer? Well, we do coaching consulting for businesses to help them implement their podcast, right? So say, for example, we have a law firm right now who we're working with. They have a team of 5, 6, 7 people, but we need a systematic and strategic approach to roll out this podcast. Dude, they have recorded 40 episodes already, right?
Wow.
Yeah. Like, talk about action. They have a great founder. His name's Jared. It's great. Arena Collective, if you want to look them up, they're in Louisiana. But definitely outlier company, right? That's what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. But they go, "Hey, we don't have the time to try to figure this out," right? So you might as well bring somebody in who it's like, "Dude, my job is the podcast. I don't have other jobs." Like, that's a job in itself, Mm-hmm. So that's essentially our bread and butter is creating these systems around the podcast for companies. And then on the lower ticket side / group coaching, we do have that. And we'll see. I mean, my 10-year vision is to obviously just mass, hit all the way up to Fortune 500, but also be able to serve, smaller podcasts too. But for now, man, we're mostly working B2B, and we're just taking it from there.
That's awesome. How big is your team now?
So we have me and Jack full-time, so 2 full-time, and then we have anywhere from 6 to 10 different freelancers in any given week. But we have kind of a core group of 5 or 6 freelancers who are essentially work part-time, almost up to full-time too. So
that's awesome. That's awesome, man. How how did Podcast Principles get started? I know you had your podcast and it did really well, and then you started kind of answering some questions. Is that really where it started kind of coming to fruition as a business?
Well, I got to give you props because you asked this at the end. This is the time to ask this, not at the beginning. So this is props to you, man. This is how it should be done. Yeah, so it started. I worked for a startup marketing company when I was in college because I applied to edit their podcast. I tried to be a freelancer, tried to do social media management. I couldn't really figure it out. Tried to do voice acting. I made $80 off of that. Got one job, so I was like, okay, I can maybe like do this freelancing thing. This company hired me, and they wanted me to come in for an interview, and I'm like, interview? Okay. So I'm going in for the interview in like New York City, you know, it's like big time. I'm like, oh man, I'm like 19 years old. And then I'm like walking to the interview, I realized I don't even know what I'm interviewing for. So it ended up being that I was hosting the podcast, editing the podcast, producing it, releasing it, marketing it, creating all the content end to end. They took me off the podcast. I thought it was they were the problem, not the podcast. So writing on the wall, I left. And then that was in December 2019, January 2020. March, I said in March, I'm starting this thing. Bought the domain. A week later, a guy emailed me. He was like, hey, man, you want to sell this domain? I'm like, all right, good. It's a good domain. Because somebody else wanted it. I'm like, oh, good. That's good. Yeah, man, March 2020. That's when it all started. So just went out and got my first contract. It was like a $4,000 or $5,000 contract, and I had to figure out. I didn't know how to charge like a credit card or a card, you know. So that was my first challenge to be like, how do I get this money from these people? But yeah, that's how it started, man. Basically, just like, hey, this isn't the problem. Like the podcast is the problem. I need to find companies who actually want to do a podcast. And oh man, then we went into our LinkedIn world, and yes, it's evolved over the years, no doubt.
Yeah, that's. I mean, obviously, that's where you and I connected was LinkedIn. I started getting into LinkedIn and doing that stuff toward the end of last year, and you were one of the first like bigger creators that I came across, and I was like, yeah, my podcast kind of sucks right now. You know, I could use a little help. So, and then here we are.
There we go. Just take some systems, man. That's it. Just some time. Just some time. Right. You know, time under tension, man. Under the bar. So. Yep. Yeah, man. That was a great time, man. It was a great time. Yeah, dude. And from inception to like the artwork, and once we got the branding down, I mean, shit, man. Your content is even in our launchpad. You know, in our group coaching program.
That's awesome.
That's really cool. So shout out to you for being in there, because I don't know that stuff, man. I know how to use Canva. Trust me, they've seen it. I've tried to show them, and they're like, I don't know what you're doing. So anyway, we go to the pros for that, man. Yeah,
I love that, man. I appreciate that a ton. Ryan, is there anything else you want to add? Any last minute advice for maybe a aspiring podcaster, an entrepreneur, or a business looking to like really get going and spark their creativity through a podcast?
Yeah, I would say before you go all in, test. Your audience will not hate you. Your clients will not leave. People will not show up at your doorstep if you go ahead and try a podcast, and it doesn't have to be this crazy official thing. Being raw and being yourself. Obviously, you want professionalism in there, but there's nothing wrong with testing an idea. Once you have actually decided, though, then actually decide and then go all in on it. It doesn't have to be. It shouldn't take over your life, right? That's what we're here for. But you have to go all in for it to work, and it takes a long time, and it's low and slow, right? Slow and steady. So, but if you do choose to do that, then more power to you, and definitely you're gonna have to go for it. But we're here to help if we can.
Ryan, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn's my main platform. It's Ryan R. Sullivan. If you type in Ryan Sullivan, I should come up now. Pretty sure I got that SEO now. And then, yeah, man, Ryan Sullivan, entrepreneur. You just need to add entrepreneur, and I'll come up on Google because I didn't get the SEO for the Google yet. It's hard. The name is too common, man. We're working on it. I got my team. Working on it. Good. No, not really. Nobody's working on it, but we'll be fine. I'll figure it out. But yeah, man, LinkedIn, Instagram, not as active on there, but you can type in Sully Bop if you want to listen to some hip hop, watching music videos and stuff. I got that too.
I dig it, man. Ryan, thank you for 1, for the coaching, 2, for being a great friend, and 3, for being on the show today, man.
Thank you, Dylan. Thanks for investing in yourself, your podcast, man. And thanks for making this podcast, obviously. This is how it works. This is the evolution, man. And this is how these things get created, man. It's not magic. It's no secret. It's,
That's right.
Just the grind, man. So Appreciate
That's
it.
right.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, brother.
Thank you for joining me today on the Canva Code. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, follow me on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, and stay tuned for more insights on how to use design and Canva to thrive. Thank you for listening, and remember, you Canva do it.